Once left in the dust, she found shelter in his hands and a heart that called her home. The Discoverith desert wind whispered secrets through the crumbling walls of what had once been the village of Calith. Thus devils danced between broken pottery and collapsed homes, erasing the last traces of lives lived and lost. Beneath the relentless sun, time moved differently here, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the slow erosion of memory itself. Tobias adjusted the worn leather strap of his pack, squinting against the glare as he picked his way through the ruins. At 42, he had spent the better part of 2 decades wandering from settlement to settlement, trading his skills as a restorer for food and shelter. His weathered hands could coax life back into broken clockwork, could make shattered ceramics whole again. It was honest work, solitary work, the kind that suited a man who had learned that people, unlike objects, couldn't always be fixed. The morning's scavenging had yielded little, a few metal springs, some glass fragments that might serve as lenses, and a handful of copper wire. He was about to turn back when something caught his eye, a shape half buried beneath a collapsed archway. Different from the usual rubble, curious, he approached and began clearing away the sand with careful hands. What emerged took his breath away. It was the figure of a young woman, perhaps 20. Carved from clay with such exquisite detail that she seemed merely to be sleeping. Her face was turned slightly upward, as if she had been gazing at stars before the sand claimed her. Long hair flowed around her shoulders like frozen water, and her hands were folded peacefully across her chest, despite centuries of burial. Her features remained remarkably intact, though hairline cracks ran like silver veins across her clay skin. Tobias had seen many artifacts in his travels, but nothing quite like this. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, far beyond anything the desert tribes could have produced. Her clothes appeared to be carved as part of her body, flowing robes that seemed to move despite their stone stillness. But it was her expression that captivated him, serene yet somehow expectant, as if she were waiting for something. He knelt beside her, brushing sand from her face with the same gentle touch he used on his most delicate repairs. The moment his fingertips made contact with her cheek, warmth pulsed through the clay so brief he almost dismissed it as imagination. But there it was again, when he touched her forehead, a faint rhythm, like a heartbeat made of earth and dreams. The rational part of his mind catalogued what he saw, an ancient statue, probably from the Old Kingdom period, crafted by a master sculptor, valuable, certainly, but ultimately just another relic of a dead civilization. Yet something deeper stirred within him as he gazed at her face. She looked so alone, so forgotten. In her stillness, he recognized his own isolation reflected. Back at him, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Soon, the night winds would rise, bringing sandstorms that could bury her again for another 1,000 years. The thought troubled him more than it should have. Tobias made his decision without fully understanding why. Working carefully, he cleared the sand from around her entire form. She was smaller than he had first thought, perhaps 5 feet tall, and lighter than solid clay should have been. As he lifted her into his arms, that strange warmth pulsed again, stronger this time, radiating from her core through his chest. The journey back to his workshop took 3 hours, with frequent stops to rest and adjust his grip. By the time he reached the small adobe house he had claimed at the edge of the ruins, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. He carried her inside and laid her gently on the workbench, beneath the oil lamp's golden glow. For a long moment, he simply stood there, studying her face. Tomorrow, he would begin the delicate work of restoration. Tonight, for the first time in years, he would not be alone. The restoration dawn filtered through the workshop's single window, casting long shadows across Tobias's collection of tools and half-finished projects. He had slept poorly, troubled by dreams of clay figures that moved when he wasn't looking and voices calling from beneath desert sands. Now, in the clear light of morning, he could better assess what he had found. The young woman, for he found himself thinking of her that way rather than as merely a statue, lay exactly as he had placed her. Yet something seemed different. The cracks in her skin appeared less pronounced, and her clay flesh held a warmth that defied the cool morning air. He attributed it to his imagination. and began his work. Tobias approached restoration like a meditation, each movement deliberate and reverent. He started by cleaning away centuries of accumulated grime, using soft brushes and distilled water to reveal the sculptor's original vision. As he worked, details emerged that took his breath away, individual eyelashes carved with impossible precision, the subtle texture of fabric, the delicate lines of her palms. Her left hand bore a peculiar mark, not damage, but something intentional. Carved into her palm was a symbol he didn't recognize, interlocking spirals surrounding a central point. When he traced it with his finger, the warmth pulsed again, and for just an instant, he could have sworn her fingers twitched. The major cracks required more dramatic intervention. He mixed a special clay compound, adding powdered minerals he had collected during his travels, quartz for clarity, iron oxide for strength, and a pinch of mica that would catch the light. As he worked the mixture into her damaged skin, smoothing and shaping with infinite patience, he found himself talking to her. "The old masters knew secrets we've forgotten," he murmured, blending a repair along her collarbone. "This clay, it's not like anything I've seen," almost as if it was mixed with something else, something alive. Days blended into nights as he worked. He repaired her cracked fingertips, restored the delicate curves of her ears, and carefully rebuilt a chip in her chin. For her eyes, he used fragments of dessert glass, polishing them until they gleamed like captured starlight. The irises he painted with pigments ground from lapis lazuli and gold leaf, creating depths that seemed to hold their own light. As the restoration progressed, Tobias began to notice changes in himself as well. The chronic ache in his shoulders, a consequence of years hunched over delicate work, began to fade. His hands, usually stiff in the mornings, moved with newfound flexibility. Most surprisingly, he had begun to hum while he worked, something he hadn't done since childhood. On the 7th day, he tackled the most challenging repair, a deep crack that ran from her left temple to her jaw. The damage was old and complex, requiring him to carefully remove damaged clay and rebuild the underlying structure. As he worked, mixing pigments to match her skin tone exactly, he noticed something that made him pause. The clay beneath the surface was not uniform. Threaded through it were what appeared to be veins of a different material, something that caught the light and seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The pattern reminded him of the circulatory system diagrams he had seen in old medical texts, but these channels carried not blood, but something that glowed faintly blue-green in the lamplight. That night, as Tobias slept in his chair beside the workbench, a storm approached from the eastern desert. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and the wind began to howl through the ruins of Calith. He woke to the sound of rain on his roof, the first precipitation in months, and the acrid smell of electricity in the air. The storm struck with sudden violence. Lightning illuminated the workshop in stark white flashes, and thunder shook the adobe walls. In one brilliant moment, a bolt struck the copper weather vane on his roof, sending a surge of energy down through the building's frame. The oil lamp flickered and died. In the darkness, Tobias heard something that made his heart stop, the soft whisper of breath, followed by the gentle rustle of movement. When the next lightning flash lit the room, he saw her clearly. Her eyes were open, those lapis lazuli depths reflecting the storm's fury. She was looking directly at him, her clay lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak. But no words came, only a gaze so intense and grateful that it reached into his chest and squeezed his heart like a fist. Then darkness returned, and when the lamp reignited, she was still again. But Tobias knew what he had seen. After 7 centuries of sleep, she had awakened, and she was beautiful. The awakening morning after the storm brought an unusual quiet to the workshop. Tobias sat in his chair, studying the figure on his workbench with new eyes. In daylight, she appeared unchanged, the same peaceful expression, the same folded hands, yet he could sense a difference, like the tension in the air before lightning strikes. He had convinced himself that the previous night had been a trick of stormlight and imagination, until he noticed her position had shifted slightly. Her head was turned a few degrees more toward him, and her right hand had moved to rest palm up beside her hip. The gesture seemed almost inviting. Throughout the morning, he worked on final details, polishing the repaired surfaces, adjusting the pigmentation around her eyes, ensuring every crack had been properly sealed. But increasingly, he found himself glancing at her face, watching for some sign of the consciousness he was certain he had witnessed. It came at midday, when the sun streamed directly through the window onto the workbench. He was mixing fresh clay to address a small imperfection near her wrist when he heard it, a soft exhalation, like someone waking from deep sleep. When he looked up, her chest was rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. "Hello," he whispered, setting down his tools with trembling hands. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing on his face with an expression of profound recognition, as if she had been waiting specifically for him. She couldn't speak, he realized, as her vocal cords were carved clay, not flesh, but her gaze held an intelligence and warmth that made words unnecessary. She sat up carefully, movements fluid despite her material nature. Her hands explored her own form, fingers tracing the places where he had made repairs. When she found the work he had done on her temple, she looked at him with such gratitude that his throat tightened with emotion. "You were broken," he said softly. I tried to fix you." She nodded, then slid gracefully from the workbench to stand before him. She was shorter than he had estimated, the top of her head reaching just to his shoulder. But there was nothing diminished about her presence. She moved with a dancer's grace, each gesture deliberate and beautiful. Communication developed naturally. Between them, she would point to objects, and he would name them, though she never attempted to speak. Her hearing was perfect. She responded to the softest sounds and seemed particularly drawn to music. When he hummed while working, she would tilt her head and close her eyes, as if the melodies were visible to her. In return, she taught him things without words. She showed him how to mix clay that would hold its shape for decades, how to identify which stones would accept pigment and which would reject it. Her hands, when they worked alongside his, seemed to imbue materials with unusual properties. Under her touch, metals became more malleable, would gain new flexibility, and colors deepened to extraordinary richness. They established routines. Each morning, she would help him organize his tools, arranging them in patterns that seemed random but somehow made his work more efficient. During the heat of midday, she would sit quietly while he worked, her presence both calming and inspiring. In the evenings, they would walk through the ruins of Calith, and she would point to certain locations with particular interest, places where he began to suspect she had once lived and worked. It was during one of these walks that he first noticed how the desert life responded to her. Lizards that normally fled at human approach would bask peacefully on rocks near her feet. Night-blooming flowers opened when she passed, even in full sunlight. Most remarkably, in places where she sat for extended periods, small green shoots would emerge from the sand, the first new growth Calith had seen in centuries. 3 weeks into their coexistence, Tobias made a discovery that changed everything. While organizing his reference materials, he found an old manuscript he had purchased years earlier from a traveling scholar. It was written in the ancient tongue of the desert kingdoms, which he could read haughtily. The text described the creation of vessels of earth and spirit, living statues crafted by master artisans who sought to preserve beauty and knowledge beyond the span of human life. According to the manuscript, these beings were created through a complex ritual involving not just skilled craftsmanship, but the conscious transfer of a portion of the Creator's own life force into the clay. They were not mere automatons, but thinking, feeling beings capable of growth and change. The text warned, however, that they remained vulnerable to those who might view them as objects rather than individuals. That night, as she sat beside him, while he read by lamplight, Tobias reached a decision that surprised him with its clarity. Whatever she was, creation of magic, miracle of ancient art, or something else entirely, she was no longer just a beautiful object. She was his companion, his teacher, and increasingly, the center of his world. But as he looked at her clay features, soft in the lamplight, he couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful existence was about to be threatened. The bonsummer settled over the ruins like a familiar blanket, bringing longer days and the deep contentment that comes from shared purpose. Tobias had never been happier. His unnamed companion, for she had no way to tell him her original name, and he felt uncomfortable assigning one, without her consent had transformed not just his work, but his entire understanding of what it meant to live. She had become essential to his craft. Her intuitive understanding of materials seemed almost supernatural. She could identify flawed metal by touch, could sense which pigments would fade and which would endure. When they worked together on particularly challenging restorations, her hands guiding his, the results exceeded anything he had achieved alone. But it was the small moments that meant the most. The way she would bring him water when he forgot to drink, her clay fingers cool against his fevered brow after long hours at the workbench, how she had learned to brew tea exactly as he liked it, though she herself could not taste, the gentle way she would touch his shoulder when he grew frustrated with a difficult repair, her presence alone enough to calm his nerves. Communication between them had evolved into something beyond words. A glance, a gesture, the tilt of her head, these conveyed more meaning than most conversations he had shared with speaking companions. She had developed her own ways of expressing joy, curiosity, even what he could only describe as affection. When pleased, she would trace spirals in the sand with her finger. When curious, she would cock her head like a bird, and when content, she would simply sit beside him, her clay hand resting lightly on his arm. The change in himself was equally profound. The chronic loneliness that had driven him to wander for decades had simply evaporated. His work took on new meaning, no longer just a way to survive, but a form of communion with beauty itself. His shoulders straightened, his step lightened, and for the first time in years, he found himself planning for a future rather than simply enduring the present. It was on an evening in late summer that everything changed between them. They had spent the day working on a complex music box that required the synchronization of dozens of tiny gears. She had shown remarkable aptitude for the delicate mechanism, her clay fingers capable of manipulations that would have been impossible for flesh and bone. As the sun set, painting the workshop in shades of gold and amber, she had suddenly stopped working and turned to look at him. Her lapis lazuli eyes held an expression he had never seen before, intense, searching, almost vulnerable. She reached out and placed her palm against his chest, directly over his heart. The moment her hand made contact, something extraordinary happened. A warmth spread from the point of contact throughout his entire body. But it was more than physical sensation. For an instant, he felt what she felt, the deep gratitude for his care, the joy she found in their shared work, and something else that made his breath catch, a profound affection that could only be described as love. The connection lasted only seconds, but it left them both changed. She pulled her hand back, eyes wide with what might have been surprise or wonder. He sat motionless, overwhelmed by the realization that what he had begun to feel for her was not one-sided. This being of clay and ancient magic, this impossible woman who had transformed his world, cared for him as deeply as he cared for her. That night, she did something she had never done before. Instead of returning to the workbench where she usually rested, she remained beside his chair as he prepared for sleep. When he looked at her questioningly, she simply took his hand and held it, her clay fingers intertwining with his flesh ones. They sat like that through the night, not speaking, she because she could not, he because words seemed inadequate. But understanding flowed between them like water, and by dawn, they both knew that whatever they were to each other, it transcended the categories of creator and creation, human and artifact. They were simply two souls who had found each other across the vast loneliness of existence. The piece was shattered 3 days later. Tobias was working on the music box's final adjustments when he heard voices approaching from the east, multiple speakers, animated and urgent. Visitors were rare in Calith, and those who came usually sought him out for specific repairs. But something about these voices made him uneasy. His companion had frozen at the first sound, her head tilted in the listening posture he had come to recognize. But her expression was not curious, it was afraid. She moved quickly to the window and peered out, then turned back to him with unmistakable alarm in her eyes. "What is it?" he whispered, moving to stand beside her. Through the window, he saw them, 5 figures in the practical clothing of treasure hunters, armed with the tools of their trade, metal detectors, excavation equipment, and unfortunately, weapons. At their head walked a woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to getting what she wanted, her gaze sweeping the ruins with the calculating look of an appraiser. As they drew closer, Tobias caught fragments of their conversation, confirmed reports of significant artifacts. Clay figures from the Caliph period bring substantial prices. Collector in the eastern cities specifically requested. His blood turned to ice. They weren't here for his restoration services. They were here for her. His companion stepped back from the window, her clay features set in an expression of grim determination. She looked at him once, her eyes conveying both love and farewell, then moved toward the workbench where his tools lay waiting. But Tobias caught her hand, stopping her. "No," he said quietly. "You're not an object to be claimed. You're not going anywhere." The voices were at his door now, and soon would come the knock that would change everything. But as he looked into her lapis lazuli eyes, Tobias knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let them take her. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, she had found shelter in his hands and a heart that called her home, and he would fight to keep it that way. The choice of heart. The knock came as Tobias expected, sharp, authoritative, designed to command rather than request. He glanced at his companion, who had positioned herself near the back of the workshop, partially hidden behind a shelf of artifacts. Her expression remained calm, but he could see the tension in her posture, the way her hands had unconsciously curled into fists. "Tobias the Restorer?" The woman's voice carried the crisp accent of the eastern merchant cities. "I am Vesara Goldhand, representative of the Crimson Collectors Guild. We need to speak with you." He opened the door partway, blocking their view of the interior. Vesara was younger than her voice had suggested, perhaps 35, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of significant wealth. Her four companions were clearly hired muscle, their hands resting casually on weapon hilts. "I'm not currently accepting new commissions," Tobias said evenly. Vesara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This isn't about a commission. We're here about an artifact you've acquired. A clay figure, female, approximately 5 feet in height, Caliph period, judging by the reports." "I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't insult my intelligence." Her smile vanished. "We have reliable sources that confirm you removed a significant piece from the ruins 3 months ago. The Guild has a legitimate claim to all artifacts from this site. Do you have documentation for that claim?" Vesara's expression hardened. "What I have, Restorer, is the backing of some very powerful people who collect beautiful things. And what I know is that you're harboring something that doesn't belong to you." From behind him came a sound that made his heart sink, the soft whisper of clay feet on stone. His companion had moved to where she could see the doorway, though she remained out of direct sight. Her lapis lazuli eyes were fixed on Vesara with an intensity that made him realize she understood exactly what was happening. "There's no artifact here," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was too late. Vesara had seen movement in the shadows behind him. Her eyes lit up with triumph and something else, a hunger that made Tobias's skin crawl. "Ah, but there is, and she's even more beautiful than described." One of her companions, a scarred man with the calloused hands of a professional excavator, pushed past Tobias before he could react. "Gods and spirits," the man breathed. "She's perfect. Look at that craftsmanship. The detail work alone must have taken years." His companion stepped fully into view then, moving with that fluid grace that still took Tobias's breath away. But there was something different about her now, a quality of presence that seemed to fill the room. When she looked at the intruders, her expression held no fear, only a quiet dignity that somehow made them all seem smaller by comparison. "Magnificent," Vesara whispered, circling closer. "The preservation is extraordinary. You've done excellent restoration work, Restorer. The Guild will of course compensate you for your efforts before we transport her to her new home." "She's not for sale," Tobias said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "She's not yours to sell." Vesara snapped. "She's a relic of a dead civilization, not a person. You can't own her any more than you can own the sunrise." His companion moved then, stepping between Tobias and the treasure hunters. She raised one clay hand and pointed directly at Vesara, her eyes blazing with an inner light that hadn't been there before. When she opened her mouth, impossibly, words emerged not spoken, but somehow projected directly into their mind's eye. Choose. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The scarred excavator stumbled backward. Hands pressed to his temples. Two of the other men cried out in shock. Only Vaisara seemed unaffected, though her face had gone pale. I am not a thing to be owned, the voice continued, clear and unmistakably female. I am not a prize to be claimed. I choose where I belong, and I choose with whom I remain. She turned to look at Tobias, and in that moment, he felt the full force of her love and gratitude wash over him like warm sunlight. I choose him, she said, her clay hand finding his. He who found me broken and made me whole. He who sees not an object, but a soul. I choose this place, this life, this love. Vaisara had recovered her composure, though her hands trembled slightly. Fascinating, some kind of enchantment, obviously. That only makes her more valuable. Grab her carefully. Don't damage the mechanism. The scarred man reached for his companion's arm. But the moment his fingers made contact with her clay skin, he screamed. Blue-white energy crackled between them, and he was flung backward into the wall. The other men drew their weapons, but seemed unsure what to do with them. She's protected. Tobias realized aloud. The original spell, it doesn't just give her life, it protects her from those who would treat her as property. His companion nodded, then turned back to Vaisara. Leave, she commanded, her mental voice now carrying overtones of power that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Tell your guild that what they seek has made her choice. I am no longer lost, no longer alone, no longer available to be possessed. For a moment, Vaisara looked as if she might argue further. But as she stared into those lapis lazuli eyes, something in her expression changed. Perhaps she saw what Tobias had learned over the months they had shared. That this was not a thing made of clay and magic, but a person with her own will, her own desires, her own capacity for love. This isn't over, Vaisara said finally, but the words lacked conviction. The guild doesn't give up easily. Then the guild will learn what I learned centuries ago, his companion replied. That some treasures cannot be taken, they can only be given. After the treasure hunters left, Tobias and his companion stood together in the sudden quiet of the workshop. He was still processing what had happened, not just her protection of their life together, but the miracle of her voice, the certainty with which she had claimed her right to choose. You can speak, he said wonderfully, when it matters most. She replied, her mental voice now soft and warm. When words are needed to protect what we have built together. And what have we built? She moved closer, placing both clay hands on his chest, over his heart. Through their connection, he felt her answer before she gave it. Home. We have built a home. That night, as they sat together in their peaceful workshop, surrounded by the tools of their shared craft, Tobias understood that he had found something far more precious than any artifact. He had found someone who had chosen him as he had chosen her, not from desperation or convenience, but from love. In the desert village where the wind carried more memories than voices, two souls had found each other across impossible circumstances. She had been left in the dust, broken and forgotten. But in his hands, she had found not just repair, but transformation. And in her choosing, he had discovered that the heart's true shelter is not a place, but a person, someone who sees your wholeness even when you are broken, who chooses you not for what you can provide, but for who you are. Together, they would continue their work fixing broken things, creating beauty, and proving every day that love, like the finest craftsmanship, can make anything whole.